Hello, world history students, and welcome to Unit 11. This is part one. It's called The Age of Anxiety. You can tell it's pretty scary just based on the background of the slide there. This is mostly about the economic problems that occur in Europe and in the world after World War One. After World War One, European countries in particular were really damaged and struggling. You think about the places that actually experienced fighting. This would be northeastern France and Belgium for the most part, were really pretty devastated by the trench warfare that was going on. And a lot of villages, a lot of cities, a lot of towns had been destroyed in those places in particular. But even places that hadn't been directly affected by the war, think about all of the ships that have been sunk by submarines and that kind of stuff. You can imagine that a lot of things had just simply been destroyed. There's also some economic problems that happen at the end of the war. Imagine all of the contracts for all of the military supplies and everything are being canceled very suddenly. Imagine a whole bunch of people who had been working in factories producing tanks or poison gas or airplanes or whatever are suddenly let go from their jobs while those factories start to produce something else. In addition to that, millions of men would be released from the armed forces, and they wouldn't have a job either. So there'd be a lot of unemployment right after the war, and really a lot of disruption until they got these factories working on other things once again. A bigger problem, perhaps, was that most of these countries were bankrupt from the war debt that they had accrued during the First World War. Imagine that spending on the war is much, much more than you could possibly afford by just collecting taxes, and that war bonds had been sold by the billions. And the people who had invested in their own country's war effort by buying those war bonds, they had to be paid back over a period of years. And so the governments really are really pretty out of money. Also, the governments are having to take care of people who are, let's say, soldiers who had been, horribly injured during the war and would never be able to work again, or they might have to take care of the families of those soldiers who died in the war, payments to widows and payments to the children of soldiers who had died in the war. So a lot of countries were really experiencing continued war costs, even, into the 1950s, 1960s, and so on. There were a number of new democracies that emerged, especially in Eastern Europe. The Russian Empire fell, it became the Soviet Union. The Ottoman Empire fell, it became Turkey. The Austro-Hungarian Empire fell and became a whole bunch of Eastern European states, and parts of the German Empire also became places like Poland. And these new states that emerged in Eastern Europe or Central Europe were really not very stable. They hadn't really experienced a good economy ever really in their history, and they really hadn't had democracy in their history, and so they have kind of a continuing lack of democracy and lack of economic success into the World War, into the interwar period. Probably one of the most difficult cases that we see in this interwar period was Germany. Germany could be argued as being in the worst shape of the countries after World War One. The Treaty of Versailles that ended World War One severely punished Germany. They were expected to pay for a lot of the cost of the war because the Treaty of Versailles said that they were 100% guilty for the war. And so they had to pay something called reparations. In other words, it's just payments of some kind from Germany to France and Britain in particular, and trying to pay for the damage that Germany caused to France and Britain, or at least paying them back for the amount of money that France and Britain had to pay to fight the Germans. So this was an economic hardship for the Germans, and then it was also a kind of national humiliation. Another thing that the Treaty of Versailles said was that the Germans weren't allowed to have a military anymore. Basically couldn't have anything that they had. The French and the British are worried that the Germans will start another war, and to prevent that, they're just going to keep them from having a military. So this led to a kind of national humiliation of the Germans. They thought that they were winning the war at the very end of the war. Suddenly they lose the war, and they're really quite surprised by that. The new government that came out of World War One was called the Weimar Republic. And this is different than the government that they had before. The government they had before was an empire. They had an emperor, and this is a democracy, the Weimar Republic. And kind of like what you saw in Eastern Europe, people weren't really used to democracy in Germany, and they weren't really very supportive of this new Weimar Republic because it had signed the Treaty of Versailles, because its economy wasn't doing particularly well, because they had to pay reparations, and because they didn't have a military. And so many Germans sort of turned against the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic tried to not pay the reparations, or they tried to pay the reparations by simply printing money, and that doesn't work. Usually it causes a kind of hyperinflation, and that's exactly what happened in Germany. You can see that picture there as of little kids playing with stacks of German bills, stacks of German money, and they had this thing called hyperinflation that made German money basically worthless. Before World War I, it was 4 German marks to the dollar, and at the worst part of the hyperinflation, it was 4 trillion marks to the dollar. And so the Germans kept printing banknotes with larger and larger and larger denominations, and they also had to start paying people twice a day because the price of bread went from 2 trillion marks for a loaf of bread to 8 trillion marks for a loaf of bread. And people were paying for bread by bringing in wheelbarrows full of cash, for example. And it just was not a very good situation. People lost faith in this new government. True, it was a democracy that should have made people happy, but it didn't, because the old empire had in many ways been more successful than this new Weimar Republic with the reparations, no military, etc., etc. In the United States, things were really much better in the 1920s than in much of Europe. The United States came in at the end of World War I, hadn't really spent that much money, in fact, had loaned a lot of money to Britain and France so that they could fight the war even before the Americans got into it. There were some disruptions after World War I in terms of soldiers coming home or people being let go from their jobs in factories, but those factories started making other things, and people were generally pretty happy to have jobs. So the early 1920s all the way up until about 1929, things were going pretty well in the United States. In fact, we call them the Roaring Twenties. Sadly, though, in the United States, there was a poor distribution of wealth. There were a few people who had lots and lots and lots of money, crazy amounts of money, and then there were really quite a number of people who were relatively poor. And some of those people worked as farmers or kind of made their existence farming, and then a lot of people also were working in factories. And a lot of the farmers and a lot of the factory workers simply weren't making very much money. Meanwhile, the factories are incredibly productive, and in fact, the farms become incredibly productive. Even though these factories and farms are creating a lot of stuff, a lot of people can't afford to buy what the factories are creating, and a lot of the times the farms are simply overproducing. The prices for their foods or whatever they're making are really quite low, so the farmers aren't really getting the benefit of that. Americans who just didn't have very much money because they were farming and not getting much money from their crops, or they're working in factories and not making very much money, simply don't have the money to buy the stuff that the factories or the farms are producing. So Americans are basically buying less. But the real problem came from the stock market. And the American stock market was booming in the late 1920s. People really hadn't figured out what the stock market was all about. They didn't know that, a stock market could be kind of a gamble, and that the value of stocks on the stock market really has a lot to do with just how people feel rather than anything else. And so people started borrowing money from banks in order to buy stocks. And sometimes they would just have 10% of their own money and 90% of the bank's money. And it was all okay because the stock market was just rocketing in value. You could buy stocks 1 week and 2-3 weeks later sell those stocks for 10, 20, 30% more than what you had purchased those at. And so people were making a killing on the stock market and paying back the bank after they had borrowed money from the bank. The problem is at some point in time, people started to think, wow, we think the stock market is overvalued, and it crashed. People started to sell their stocks in October of 1929, and it just bottomed out in a kind of crazy way. People were trying to desperately sell their stocks. Nobody wanted them, and the value of the stocks decreased. Well, the people who had borrowed money from banks to buy those stocks couldn't pay the banks back because what was once, valuable stock was really worth pennies or nothing. And so this really hurt the banks as well because the banks weren't being paid back. They just had to accept those losses. The Great Depression is what comes from this. It is just a worldwide economic downturn. People lost their savings as banks closed. Imagine that. The banks had loaned all this money. They're not getting that money back from people. And so the banks don't have money to give people. People show up at the bank and say, I want my money back. And the bank says, sorry, we just don't have any. Businesses need money in order to purchase the raw materials that they're going to make into things and things like that. They couldn't borrow money from banks. Businesses too were failing because nobody was able to buy their products. Banks were closing, as I said. Factories were cutting production because there was nobody buying anything. And unemployment increased greatly. This economic downturn affected economies all across the world. And so, when the United States stock market crashes, everybody else's stock market starts to crash because everybody else gets worried that the stock markets are overvalued. And as one country realizes that people aren't buying enough of its own products, they want to keep other countries' products out, and they throw up tariffs. And so international trade slowed down too. There's just a huge slowdown of trade and just a lot of problems. Well, that's it for the age of anxiety. We'll start talking about maybe more exciting things when we start talking about totalitarianism and fascism and that kind of thing in the next lecture. Thanks so much. Have a nice day.